What's up, everybody? Thralls Mötley here once again. I'm Necrotic, and I'm here doing something I surprisingly have never done on the channel, and kind of feels like maybe I should, considering the vast amount of time that I have spent talking shit about albums that I don't like. So for the first time ever, I'm going to go over my most disappointing albums / the worst albums of 2024 in my opinion. Now, a couple of things before I go in this list. Disappointing does not equal bad on here. This kind of has like a gradient scale in terms of how I arrange this list to, bands that I just feel kind of miss the mark, and then as they go on, they get closer to that whole realm of just being flat out bad. Now, there's also a number of albums that I just didn't listen to that I really didn't formulate an opinion on. So as much as some people might want to tune in to watch me shit on Falling in Reverse, I didn't listen to that album because I didn't listen to that album. Don't worry, I'm not saying it's not like complete garbage. I'm sure it actually is. I didn't even see like Ronnie's most ardent fans really go out of their way to defend it. They were just like, yeah, don't make fun of Ronnie. He's a guy I worship. Yeah, so even if like the knuckle-dragging chimpanzees that are the vast majority of Falling in Reverse fans out there won't defend that album, that's a pretty good indication that it sucks. So maybe that's like an honorable mention. I don't know. I don't really care. All right, let's get this started off with the disappointing ones. And right out of the gate, one of the first ones I thought of was Shrapnel's last album, In Gravity. I reviewed this one solo, and I was very hesitant. I heard one of the singles and realized that this was definitely going to be a change in style. And then when I saw like the album cover and just the lack of anything that echoes awesome thrash metal kind of exuding from that album cover, I really got worried. And then I listened to it and, well, they just kind of wrote a bland melodic metalcore groove metal album. It's really just kind of a non-affair, and it's especially disappointing because I think they were coming off what I'd see as like their best album. This band was an awesome thrash band, and while you get like a couple of moments on that album where you get like some solid thrash riffs, it never hangs out long. This album is kind of going for like kind of tried and true hooks that would be, I don't know, maybe a little bit more popular around like 2005, but now it just feels very stale, and it feels like they're trying to sound like Trivium or Silosis, and they just flat out don't have the songs for it. And even in comparison to those bands, this kind of just felt very neutered, very watered down, very safe, and, well, I mean, super disappointing because I had, reasonably high expectations, at least based on the last one. But this album, sadly, just missed the mark for me, and yeah, really disappointing. Next one up, and this album was definitely divisive with the fans for sure, was Swallow the Sun with their new album, Shining. Now, I probably should have listened to some singles before this came out, but I was just excited to expose John to another cool death doom band that he hadn't listened to. Like, I had the pleasure of exposing him to My Dying Bride this year. They put out a great album. And in terms of like older bands, there's still a lot of things he needs to catch up on, especially like older death doom, and Swallow the Sun is a band I 100% think he should get into. And this did not really push him much towards that until I actually played him some of their older stuff. I was a huge fan of Moonflowers. I thought that album was just dark, haunting, melancholic, but it was also brutal. And I kind of understand maybe why this band changed their sound given everything that they've been through over the past, few years, actually, maybe more than a few. Tragedy, isolation from the pandemic, that weighs on a person. But to come out with this album, which, I mean, it still has some hallmarks of Swallow the Sun sound, but it is more bright, kind of poppy at times. I'm not a big fan of the very polished production on here, especially the drum sound. This is such an abrupt shift from the last one that it is rather jarring. At points on here, I was reminded more of Muse than I was of Swallow the Sun. You could also draw comparisons to when Catatonia started shifting their sound after Brave Murder Day, and at least that took a while. They really had to kind of like work on that sound to get it to where at least I thought it was really coming together, especially on like Viva Emptiness. Basically, they took the time to build a new brand and a new sound for the band. This just kind of shifted tracks immediately to the point where I would say this is almost better suited for a side project rather than Swallow the Sun itself. This shift is a shift that can really alienate fan bases, and that was definitely reflected in the comments in our review. While there are definitely some people that really enjoyed this album, I really just kind of felt indifferent. Like, yeah, the music is well executed for what it is, but it's definitely not what I ordered. And, you know, the moments where it kind of like echoed the sound that I really wanted, they were very short-lived. I get wanting to like shift tracks and write something a little bit more positive and trying to kind of like lift yourself out of the darkness, but this band is kind of built on darkness, which is, again, why I say this is maybe better suited for a side project. So yeah, this was a big disappointment for me. I really gave it a lot of different tries, and it just doesn't gel with me completely. Again, I don't think it's necessarily bad. I just think it's not for me. Next one up, another one that I had high expectations for, especially given the fact that their last album was an absolute banger, and I would say is among one of the best albums in their discography. And that was Darkest Hour with Perpetual Terminal. I was really hyped up for this one. I've been a fan of this band since at least their second album. Though I will say that their third album, Hidden Hands of a Sadist Nation, was the one that absolutely made me a fan. And there was a good run of albums after that. And this band has kind of had this pattern of like having a couple of good albums, dropping off the next one, building themselves back up. And, you know, you kind of get this kind of wave pattern that happens. And their last album before this one, Godless Prophets and the Migrant Flora, was an absolute banger. They just went for the rage. Kurt Ballew's production on it sounded great. It was gritty and biting and snarling, but it also still had their, like, you know, very at the gatesy melodies peppered in there too. And I was kind of expecting something kind of close to that, but this album just felt really uneven, especially for a band that I feel like kind of found their focus on the last one. There's still some good songs in here. There's some great lead work. John Henry sounds as vicious as ever, but a lot of the songs, they kind of felt very stock. Like they kind of felt like they went into like a holding pattern to like a safer sound, like, you know, more just straight up 2000s, you know, metalcore with at the gates riffs, which, I mean, yeah, they're good at it, but they also knew how to add some flair to them and give them like some extra snarly crunch. This just feels, I don't know, like very pedestrian for them. The production was fine. We actually got to see them live with Exodus and Fit for an Autopsy and Undeath, and they had an absolutely killer set. But this album just kind of lacks energy and, again, focus, because the songs kind of were a little bit all over the place. It didn't have like a very uniform kind of attack to it. Again, another one I wouldn't say is necessarily bad, but again, considering what it follows, it feels decidedly weaker. And honestly, if I want to listen to like recent Darkest Hour, I'm probably not going to come back to this one as much as I would, say, other albums, like namely the last one. Next up for me is Nocturnus AD, Unicursal. Again, another one that I had, you know, reasonably high expectations for. I'm a huge fan of Nocturnus, regular Nocturnus. Their album, The Key, I think that is an absolutely amazing and kind of genre-breaking Floridian death metal album since it was proggy, it featured synths. Mike Browning is one hell of a writer when it comes down to like, you know, composing all of these like technical progressive elements and still giving it like a good death metal crunch. And when they came back with Paradox under Nocturnus AD, I thought that album was pretty solid. Like, it's fiercely technical, lots of like jazz fusion parts and crazy drum work and just kind of crazy everything with their weird sci-fi themes. And when I saw that this one was coming out, I was, you know, reasonably excited for it. And then Shred and I reviewed it, and man, this album was just sort of a mess. I feel like Mike got way too fixated on the concept and he kind of lost the sense of the music, because the music is technical and wild, but it's sort of aimless. The song structures just feel off. And then there's Mike's vocals, which are not great. Instead of like delivering like a more like fierce roar or something that has like some more vocal inflection in it, he went with this very robotic cadence that literally follows the same meter regardless of which track you find. It always sounds like this when he talks about anything in these songs. It's more narration, but he's trying to add some gruffness to it. And while that is a unique approach, it's also really off-putting. You have this insanely technical, wild music and then like the most boring vocal delivery on top of it. It does nothing to make these songs more interesting. In fact, it makes them more of a chore to listen to. I like crazy technical music like Cynic and Atheist and all sorts of crazy shit like that. But I like hearing like some interesting melodies peppered in there and vocal phrasings, whether they're growled or sung or screamed or whatever. If those are part of the music and it's not just instrumental stuff, then they should add something to it. And these vocals kind of ruined the experience. I felt like someone was like yelling lines from L. Ron Hubbard books or Lovecraft, and it just became annoying. There are some moments of like cool music on here, like I'm not completely shitting on like the musical ability of this band, but getting past that wall of narration is a hell of a chore. So yeah, yet another one that just kind of disappointed the hell out of me. Next one on here was one that I didn't expect to be as disappointing as it was, but I mean, I suppose that's kind of the story with some of these. Well, all right, towards the back half, no, not really, because that would imply I had expectations. But this album, I had expectations. And I'm talking about Gaerea with Coma. Again, one that I don't think is necessarily bad, but following Mirage and honestly all of their albums, this one feels very lackluster and, I don't know, just kind of there. Like, it's very listless and very airy. Like, yes, this band does a, more post-black metal sound with lots of layered, lush tremolo harmonies and dissonance and, again, like agonized vocals. But this album just kind of felt flat. There wasn't that same urgency, and honestly, it didn't feel as dark. The melodies on here felt entirely too bright for, well, at least what I expected. And despite this being kind of hard to tell if, there was a member change because of the shrouds and their kind of like uniform look, this was the first one with a new vocalist on here, and I didn't like the vocal delivery because it echoed something entirely different in terms of the band style. The original vocalist had this harrowing, ghastly, but very desperate delivery that really added to like this just kind of like big, lush, blackened sound that they had. The new guy's sound is a little bit more like metalcore-ish, but like more atmospheric metalcore. Like I would say like Poison the Well is kind of similar in spots, but with some of the brighter melodies and some of the different riff styles that come up on here, there's definitely some mellow death moments. It kind of echoed more of that like mid-2000s metalcore in some ways, or rather in enough of a way to just kind of throw off the sound. Again, another one that I didn't think was necessarily bad, but it definitely wasn't what I ordered, and where I see Mirage as probably their best album, it's kind of close with that and Unsettling Whispers. This feels like kind of a drop-off. And full disclosure, I bought some of these. I'm just not showing them here because I didn't want to fish them out of the collection. But yeah, I had much higher expectations for this one. In fact, out of almost all of these, this was probably the one that I had the highest expectations for, given how awesome that last album was. And at least in the comments from the review, I definitely saw a fair amount of division with this album. Some people loved it, thought it was, their best work. Others, a little bit more on the fence. And then there were a few that just flat out didn't like it either. I'm more in the middle on this one. I think it's just kind of disappointing overall, but still, I suppose for the sound that they might have been going for in this one, they did it pretty well, but it just wasn't for me. Next up was the one that I had, moderately high expectations for. I do like this band's past work, was Fleshgod Apocalypse with their album Opera. Now, I like earlier Fleshgod Apocalypse. I mean, I like pretty much everything all the way up to King, which I thought was a really solid album too. But as this symphonic blackened death metal band went on, you can definitely tell that they were going for more accessible hooks and letting these symphonic elements define more of the music than, say, the death metal elements. Their earlier stuff has ridiculous blast beats, insane riffing. Like, it's, more along the lines of bands like Hideous Divinity and Hour of Penance in terms of the flat-out brutality and speed of it. But you have that operatic, symphonic element behind it, which kind of gives it this extra like scope and grandiosity. This new album kind of just went with mostly that more like epic operatic sound. That extra atmospheric touch the band added to their sound that, kind of like, pushed them out in the limelight a little bit and made people notice them, became the thing that, was like the bulk of the music, because the music behind it on this album I just thought was really dull. It was definitely more mid-tempo. The riff complexity was way dialed down. Lots of vocal dynamics, and I do like the operatic vocals, and the growls are pretty cool, but at the same time the whole thing felt cluttered, and it felt like I got more of a night at the opera than I did, a night at a metal show. Now, symphonic metal is a little hit or miss to me. Like, there are bands that I like that really do it well, like Septic Flesh, which I think, honestly, in terms of like symphonic death metal, they might be the best ones. They're kind of like the gold standard for me. And Fleshgod Apocalypse was kind of not far behind that, but I like them because of the absolute brutality that they had and that symphonic element. They're two elements that don't seem like they should go together, but honestly, they worked pretty well early on. Here, it just sounds like, you know, Septic Flesh light with an operatic vocalist who, again, I think she was really solid, but this really wasn't what I wanted out of this band. Now, again, I will say that my expectations weren't super high for this one, but I'll also say that I, again, definitely expected more. Next up was one that I was kind of hyped for because this is the follow-up to a comeback album from this band, and that was Evil Dead with Toxic Grace. Their comeback album I thought was pretty solid. I wasn't like the biggest fan of the production on it, but overall, like, it had, you know, biting, snarling guitars, you know, it was fast-paced, it was energetic, it was, you know, ready to throw a rager at your house. And when I heard they were doing a follow-up, I was like, yeah, let's check this one out. And, well, it's just kind of there. Like, honestly, in terms of thrash metal that I listened to this year, this is one of the dullest thrash albums I listened to this year. The riffs feel very stock, very flat. The vocal performance on here, there's like no energy to it. Like, I get that they are older and, you know, vocal cords do wear down over time, but there doesn't even sound like there's an effort to really kind of just make them sound more snarly and more biting. Like, you kind of need that in thrash. Unless you're kind of going the more speed metal route where it's a little bit more sung, but I don't think that's ever been this band's thing. In fact, no, it hasn't. But outside of like the music, like I thought the lyrics were kind of dumb and a little cringy on there. Like, it kind of came across as just like old dudes complaining about the modern world and blah, blah, blah. And I'm pretty sure they use the term woke in there, but it's whatever. Generally, when I hear someone say, oh, that shit's woke, I'm instantly checking out of the conversation. I'm just nodding at you at that point. The album did still have like a couple of standout tracks in it, but I mean, honestly, if I want to listen to Evil Dead, I would 100% go back to their debut album because that one absolutely rips. And I would say it's still probably the best album in their discography. But yeah, this, I just feel like I was listening to like a really lethargic version of Exodus. And that's not what I want out of Evil Dead, and that's definitely also not what I want out of Exodus either. So yeah, while my expectations weren't like super, super high on this one, they were marginally high because I do like this band, and yeah, this one let me down pretty hard. Next one up is a debut album from a supergroup, and well, I mean, the old saying about the sum of the parts doesn't necessarily equal the whole. It applies to Category 7 with their self-titled album. I wanted to like this. Like, dude, you got Phil Demmel on there, you got John Bush. John Bush is still one of my favorite vocalists ever. You had Jason Bittner from Overkill and Shadows Fall. The bassist from Exodus, I can't remember his name right now. And Mike Orlando from Adrenaline Mob. That's not a bad cast of veterans in metal right there. And you'd figure with all of them inputting their ideas from their vast wealth of experience in the scene that, you know, the odds are you would get something pretty cohesive. But the results, they weren't that. Like, this was just sort of a run-of-the-mill heavy metal album with elements of groove metal and thrash every now and then. And it felt kind of messy in terms of its construction. Like, sometimes solos would come in at weird points. Jason Bittner, while he's an absolute beast of a drummer, he might have been too much of a beast of a drummer in here because he was just going ham on here. Like, maybe overdoing a lot of points. And the songs themselves, like, you know, they were kind of like bare bones. Like, yeah, John Bush can absolutely carry an awesome tune and a good chorus, but the choruses kind of felt a little bit flat, like he was trying to do like a more edgy, more mean-spirited Armored Saint, and it just didn't necessarily work. I ended up comparing like the individual performances to the actual songs, and well, again, like individual performances I thought were solid. The songs themselves were a little flat, and then as I started reading up on this, and as the commenters told us that, you know, Mike Orlando was the one that wrote the majority of this wasn't written really as a band. I believe the lyrics were written by John Bush, but when it came down to like the music itself, a lot of this stuff was already there by the time the guys got there and decided, hey, let's get together and do a band with, well, Mike's stuff. And the results were a really okay album with, you know, moderately high expectations just because of who was in it. But yeah, supergroups are kind of a tricky thing. Sometimes they work out. Sometimes, again, you just get a collection of musicians that just don't gel, but they're famous. So you throw them together anyway. And that was the case here, sadly. Next up, we have one that's probably been showing up on a lot of disappointing albums lists. I mean, it showed up on like a best of list for Rolling Stone, but who the fuck reads Rolling Stone for anything metal related? And I'm talking about Kerry King from Hell I Rise. Honestly, in a way, I would say that this album met my expectations, which my expectations were pretty minimal. In fact, my expectations were, hey, this is just going to be Slayer leftovers with, Mark Osueda doing vocals on it. And that's exactly what it was. In fact, a good chunk of these songs were actually written during the Repentless sessions, and they were just kind of like the cast-offs that didn't make it to the album. And if Slayer leftovers were what you were expecting and what you really wanted, then that's awesome. But for me, these leftovers really weren't that fresh. Like, these didn't, pass the whole open the Tupperware and give it a sniff to make sure it doesn't smell like, moldy asshole before ingesting it. Like, this stuff just felt dated right away. Like, it's not doing anything to, revitalize thrash. It's Kerry King doing what you expect from Kerry King, which, yeah, he's written some good songs in the past, 100%. But for me, most of the killer songs that I love by Slayer were written by Jeff Hanneman. Kerry King is good at the machine gun chugging fast songs. That's kind of his wheelhouse, and on these songs I feel like he just kind of did that, and when he tried to get outside of that, the results were kind of a mixed bag. This has got some good heavy breakdowns every now and then, and Mark's vocal delivery on here I think is great, but the songs themselves are pretty forgettable. Are you going to put this on instead of your favorite Slayer album or your second favorite Slayer album or fifth or sixth favorite Slayer album? Probably not. But maybe if it comes on randomly, are you going to turn it off? Maybe not. It's not terrible, but it is just very plain, scoop of vanilla and then another scoop of vanilla. You don't even get chocolate sauce or sprinkles on this thing. It's just kind of vanilla thrash. But I still know a lot of people that did dig this one, and I do like Mark Osueda's vocal performance on it. He sounds just razor sharp and vicious on it. But that's kind of the biggest thing that I really liked on it. Outside of that, you should just listen to Slayer, let's be honest. Next up, and we're getting down to stuff that just really disappointed me, bordering on just bad here, and that is God Dethroned with the Judas Paradox. Back-to-back snooze fests for this band, sadly, and I am a longtime fan of this band. I love a lot of their earlier work. Their debut, The Christ Hunt, absolutely vicious, awesome death metal. Their whole trilogy of war epics too, I thought were awesome. But this band has just kind of lost their fire. This went from God Dethroned, get the fuck out of that chair, to could you please move, sir? And then God says, and then just go, well, okay. Not a lot of the material on this album has a lot of bite to it. There's no urgency. The songs aren't very explosive for the most part. They kind of rely on the atmospheric production to kind of give it a spooky texture, but the music behind it is just not very interesting. A lot of it kind of feels hypocrisy B-sides with a blackened touch to it. There's just not much fire to it. And there are flashes and moments on this album where hey, that kind of sounds like the stuff that I got into with Passchendaele or whatever album it was. But they're very short-lived, and again, they kind of get into these monotonous, very dull riffs and transitions that don't work. This album is just disjointed, and again, it doesn't feel like everyone was very inspired with this one. That lack of energy really kills it for me on this album. And that was a thing that I definitely detected on Illuminati too. It just wasn't very, energetic or inspired. It just kind of fell flat. So this band has been on kind of a 2-album skid, and I mean, will I check out future ones by them? More than likely, because I really want this band to kind of get back to what they were doing really well. But here lately, the results have been just kind of there. All right, now we're getting close to the albums that I just think are kind of bad. And this one kind of hovers and disappointing, but I mean, honestly, going back to it, I don't know, it's just a lackluster affair. And I know a lot of fans really super hyped for this one, and this is, again, debatably outside of the metal spectrum, even though I would say that this band still has ties to metal. And that is Linkin Park with From Zero. This album is very safe, very predictable. They pretty much wrote an album that would appeal to any listener of Linkin Park through any of their phases, both the early first 2 albums and then Minutes to Midnight on, and some of their more poppier stuff, and their more electronic stuff. And while some of it wasn't necessarily bad, A lot of it was just very plain background music for a Michael Bay flick that I haven't watched yet and probably won't watch because it's just going to be stupid. The rollout for this was pretty awkward. Like, all right, their backs were up against the wall when it came down to replacing Chester Bennington, which, you know, I still have profound respect for that guy. He was an awesome guy in general, and he's still sorely missed. And Emily Armstrong's introduction as their new co-vocalist didn't roll out the way they probably wanted it to. You know, the ties to Scientology, the Danny Masterson trial thing, and yeah, that kind of came across as, well, awkward at best, and arguably maybe a little socially tone deaf when it comes down to, like, you know, Scientology's beliefs when it comes down to self-deletion, we'll say. Couple that with Chester Bennington, yeah, it feels awkward, and I mean, a lot of it kind of feels like a money grab, but yeah, like the album itself was just there. Like, yeah, it sounds like Linkin Park doing Linkin Park things from various points of Linkin Park's career, but it's not done with the same fire. And while there are some songs that I like, I probably won't be going back to it. So yeah, this one was kind of a dud. Next up, and this one's been a fun one to talk about because more keeps getting revealed with this band, this person. Of course, I am talking about As I Lay Dying with Through Storms Ahead. Basically, we'll talk about the album too, but of course we have to talk about Tim, the giant fuck up that he is. First off, accurate title for this album, considering, yeah, there's been a lot of storms that have popped up before and after this release. Tim started bleeding band members, like pretty much the levee just broke. All of them kind of vaguely citing particular behavior of one individual, and, well, yeah, you can guess which one it was. But that, and releasing just a bland, boring, paint-by-numbers, melodic metalcore album, were the least of Tim's worries, but I'll get into that after I trash this album some more, because, yeah, it's just the same shit that he has put out before. All the songs kind of repeat the same dynamic. You have the clean chorus, except for, like, one track. You have Tim roaring indistinctly. You have stock metalcore riffs that just pretty much sound like he's recycled them from previous albums that they already wrote. To me, at least, if, you know, I could look past Tim being a giant shit show, like the whole, you know, hiring the hitman thing and going to jail, then really not serving much time at all, and I don't know, kind of glancing over accountability, and then of course everyone leaving and all that shit. If I could look past all that stuff and just rate it purely on the music, I would feel like I just bought, like, Shadows Are Security, except this is like the Kmart version of it. Or An Ocean Between Us, too. We'll go with that one, too. All the songs kind of have the same basic dynamics, the same basic song structure, the same kind of production, even though the production in here was really muddy, but still really overproduced. There's nothing on here that would get me excited for future releases because I feel like I know exactly what I would get because that's all Tim wrote for this. But since this album dropped and since we reviewed it, you know, the whole trashing of Tim thing, there's been some videos that came out. I believe his possibly ex-wife now, I know that she changed her name back, posted some very, very damning videos, and even if you tried to add some context to it, I don't think you can apologize for the behavior in it. Tim comes off looking like a psychopath who repeatedly punches himself in the face and yells at this lady to love him. And what's worse is he seemed like he tried to, like, intercept that move by putting up a post on his Instagram, or As I Lay Dying's Instagram, it's probably the same fucking thing, trying to say that, you know, she's the abuser and blah, 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 blah. And then the videos come out and it's like, man, are you sure she's the abuser? Because it looks a lot different in those videos. Like, we didn't even need sound in that first video to know you were just fucking losing your shit and acting like a complete psychopath. Old habits die hard, I guess. Anyway, the album itself, absolutely just bland, banal, mid-tier fucking metalcore for a band that was, like, heralded as, like, one of the best in the whole scene way back when. It's a flat-out turkey for fans only, if this band even has fans anymore. I haven't seen a lot of the Tim stalwarts come out and say, no, he's misunderstood or whatever. Now, I'm going to apologize for an abuser. Yeah, they're all kind of quiet right now for reasons. Anyway, next up, decidedly less drama with this band, but also very disappointing to the point where I would just say this is a flat-out bad album. Dust Bolt with Sound and Fury. Fury sold separately. This band was an awesome German thrash metal band. I have all their albums, including this one. And I noticed some cracks start to form with the one before this one where they started exploring more melody, more mid-tempo songs, stuff that was like definitely outside of thrash metal. Their first 3, I think, are awesome. Just go for the throat, biting, snarling thrash. Lots of elements of like Slayer, Creator, Sodom, just, good, solid thrash metal. And again, that 4th album was kind of a mixed bag. And then this one, well, I mean, look at the album cover. Like, you could almost tell that this was going to suck just by, like, how much effort was put into this. This is kind of, like, again, what Shrapnel did, but worse. Like, there's, like, elements of just, like, goofy hard rock. There's attempts at some more humorous songs, more clean vocals, but honestly, the vocals aren't, like, a good selling point to begin with. They come across as flat anyway. And this being more focused on trying to have, like, more melodic, almost kind of like hard rock hooks, it just doesn't work. This sounds like a band just kind of reaching for a new sound and just abandoning what they were good at. Like, I get it. Thrash rarely pays the bills unless you're a long-time established act like, Testament, Metallica, and Anthrax, and so on. But still, I think they formed like a pretty decent fan base around those earlier albums. And this one just kind of feels like maybe a cash grab for whoever was in the mood for this. Like, I don't even know what the demographic is in terms of like the target audience they were going for. It certainly wasn't their old fan base, that's for damn sure. I just don't know with this album. Like, it's just kind of a bad, uneven, all over the place album that, again, it feels like it's trying to reach for a new fan base, but it doesn't know which one to reach for, and it just came across as just a clunky, awkward wreck. Next up, and yeah, this album I thought was just flat out bad, and it's kind of sad too. Except Humanoid. Now, since like kind of getting back to their sound with Mike on vocals, they've had some solid albums. I went back and checked them out. I've been meaning to get them for a while. Just good, solid, classic heavy metal based on like good, catchy riffs and guitar harmonies and leads. But they were also a little gruff and kind of like tough old men. And I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And admittedly, I had maybe some expectations for this one because we went over the one before that, and this is another one where you kind of felt the cracks were starting to show. And, well, this new one, Humanoid, is just bland. Like, at points it feels like an AC/DC cover band playing at a bar. And you're stuck there because your friend, and also your right, is still trying to hook up with that bartender that has no interest in him whatsoever. Like, that's the scenario where a good chunk of this album is playing. It's just kind of bland and basic, and while I like good old-fashioned meat and potato stuff, you can still season it. You can still kind of give it some flavor. Like, dude, old school bands like Judas Priest and Saxon and Satan all had solid albums this year. Why is this album so bereft of like any ideas that really jump off the page? Like, honestly, it wasn't until the last track in this album that it felt like it kind of sprang to life. I don't want to say that this band has hung on too long, even though I could definitely make that argument since they've been around since, I want to say, the early 70s. But if this is kind of the quality of releases that we're going to get from them now, honestly, like, there would be no shame in hanging it up after a long career. Like, this is like one of those albums that makes me think maybe they should just kind of retire. They got a good back catalog to rest their laurels on, and no one would fault them. But I have a feeling that, this band's likely going to keep going on. I just hope the next one's just more inspired, because this was a total dud. Next up, speaking of duds, and admittedly this was a dud that I was kind of expecting because the bulk of this band's discography is arguably duds. And I'm talking about Anvil. One and only. And to reference the little title that I threw at the end of that review, this was the one and only time that I listened to this album. I have not come back to it because it is flat out bad. Now, I didn't expect much, really. Like, I expected very little, and I feel like I got either exactly that or a little bit less than little, which, yeah, I don't have a lot of glowing things to say about this. The production's bad. The riffs are bland and very repetitive. The lyrics are, wow, just flat out dumb. I legit felt like a parent stuck at a middle school battle of the bands because your kid's performing and you want to be there and be supportive, but holy hell, you have to go through a lot of shitty music to do that. That was this album. There really weren't any songs in here I was like, dude, that's just flat out awesome. The best I could say is like maybe like the last track, Blind Rage, was okay. Like, it had a good riff on it. And, well, they made sure to just beat that riff over your head to the point where you started questioning whether or not you liked it. That's like a huge thing with this album is like, you know, they'll find a riff that's all right, but then they'll just hang on it way too long and do nothing with it. Now, as I said in the review, there's part of me that kind of roots for these guys. Like, I would love for them to come out with like an absolute banger of an album and, you know, people fucking talk about them in not the context that I'm talking about them again. I own the documentary, The Story of Anvil. I go back and watch that every now and then because there's like, you know, kind of a feel-good element to it. And I can't say like I actively root against this band. Like, I would consider going to see them live because I hear they're really nice guys and they have fun playing live. And I do like some of their early albums, but man, this is just terrible. Like, to the point where I kind of just wonder if anyone was in the studio going, are you sure you want to record that? Like, do you have literally any other ideas? Oh, these are the lyrics? Let me check those out. Holy shit, really? You sure you didn't just like hand a pen and paper to like a 12-year-old kid and say, here, write about things? Yeah, there were no silver linings to listening to this one. It was just time that got stripped away from me because we wanted to do a review. I know a lot of people ended up watching it, and this band definitely has some like solid diehard fans that got a little bit pissy with me, and maybe John too, maybe me though, because I probably said shittier things. But again, know that, you know, there's part of me that does root for this band because, again, I just kind of like them as people. It's just, I wish their music didn't suck. Like, that's the basic point I'm trying to get out. But yeah, this was bad. Like, I got nothing else. Like, it's just a bad fucking album by some really nice Canadian gentlemen. All right, there are two more albums on this list, or rather an album and an EP, and I'm reasonably sure you guys probably know which ones these will be because these are probably the ones that you've been waiting for me to bring up. First up, 6 Feet Under, Killing for Revenge. I will say, again, that this is better than Nightmares of the Decomposed, but that's like saying AIDS is better than cancer. That album in particular, I guess you could say was rock bottom, but personally, I think they dug past the fucking bedrock to find a new low on that one. It was just awful across the board. We absolutely savaged that album, rightfully so. It was a fucking turkey. I know that it has its fans, and I am still fucking blown away by that. But with this new album, I mean, again, arguably, it was better. But guess what? It was still bad. While the songs did have like more energy occasionally, like you get some thrashier numbers, it still suffered from a lot of the same issues that, well, the last one did. And by that, most of 6 Feet Under's discography. Like, I don't think they have a lot of good albums, in fact. Now, granted, I haven't listened to all of them, but that sounds like a horrible thing to do anyway, like spend a day listening to all of 6 Feet Under's discography. No, and in fact, I would probably skip the Graveyard Classics because no one needs to hear that shit. But yeah, back to this album. It's, again, just basic, run-the-mill, meat potatoes death metal with, like, no seasoning. And once again, Barnes sounds terrible. Now, I guess you could say he sounds better than he did on the last one, and that might be due to one key thing. He doesn't do the big thing. The internet literally trolled that register of his vocal cords out of his body. Like, it just completely left. In fact, I know people that asked him point blank on Instagram, hey, why didn't you do the thing? And he was like, because they made fun of me for it. Which, while that noise is fucking annoying, it's like someone violently shaking a cicada in their hand and putting it up against a bullhorn. Honestly, that was kind of one of the things that made the last one memorable. And by extension, probably all the other ones that he did that noise because you're like, what the fuck was that? Like, this album is just super bland and it's not even like really meme worthy. Like, it just came out, it happened, and I'm sure he said something like, you know, this is going to be better than like the last 4 Cannibal Corpse albums. And it wasn't. Even with Jack Owen on guitars and like members of like Cannabis Corpse and 2 members of Brain Drill on there, it just comes across as just this plodding, boring, just by the numbers death metal affair. Neanderthal might be one of the worst songs I think I've heard this year as far as death metal goes. Like, I don't even know what inspired that song. Like, they got high and watched National Geographic and they had a special on caveman and like, I like the sound of the word Neanderthal. And then that became the chorus, except for the I like the sound of the word part. Like, he just says Neanderthal. Immediately, I mean, if he's doing like a caveman impersonation, that's pretty fucking close. So yeah, needless to say, my expectations for this one weren't high. But I give it some credit that it was slightly better than like the worst fucking death metal album I'd heard recently, or at least within like the last 5 years. We'll go with that. But it still wasn't good at all. And one of the worst albums that came out this year easily. But to 6 Feet Under's credit, it wasn't the worst. The worst piece of shit that I listened to this year was easily Mötley Crüe's Canceled. Even the Mötley Crüe diehards, which I don't know how many of them actually showed up in the comments, I can understand why. I know maybe some of them thumbs down the video, but I don't know, fuck them. But seriously, even the diehards, I never hear them talk about recent Mötley Crüe. Like, if you bring up Mötley Crüe around a Mötley Crüe diehard, they usually kind of shut the fuck up after Dr. Feelgood. And then after that, it's like, well, you know, like Saints of Los Angeles was okay. You don't hear them talk about Generation Swine. You don't even hear them talk about New Tattoo, because I think most of them, like me, kind of forgot that album existed. And baseline, like, if you break down a good chunk of Mötley Crüe's discography, which, believe me, I have been, a lot of stuff minus a handful of albums, a very small handful of albums, is pretty cringy, especially when you come down to like the lyrics and such. And hearing a band this old complain about being canceled and all that shit, it's fucking sad. Like, seriously, you guys wrote songs about trying to hook up with 15-year-old chicks when you were in your 30s. You might have fucking earned it. And hell, let's be even more honest. I think most people probably know you guys more by the notoriety than they do by the music. Like, yeah, you know, the hits are the hits and they're pretty well known, but yeah, like no one talks about Mötley Crüe deep cuts. Unless it's on like the first two albums maybe, or, you know, the self-titled one that, well, you know, again, Mötley Crüe fans just don't talk about. But yeah, back to this EP. The songs are dull. They are overproduced. John Five steps in on guitar to write basic riffs that I hope he overcharged them for. And within this very short listen, I just had so many questions, like, why actively try to ruin the Beastie Boys with that garbage-ass cover? And one of the biggest questions for me is, how many different filters or layers of auto-tune does it take to make Vince Neil sound like he can actually sing? He can't. I don't think he's ever been a good singer. Like, he's been serviceable at best, but yeah, here, like, it's like an AI-generated voice that sounds like, well, Vince Neil, which in turn sounds like a Muppet that just, I don't know, took down a whole balloon full of helium. Like, this EP was so bad that it had me questioning as to why this band was relevant outside of just like a nostalgic thing for the old fans. Like, I can't imagine this brings in new fans. Like, it's just run-the-mill butt rock, and it's not even like particularly fun to listen to. Like, the choruses feel flat. I mean, again, shitty vocals and just bland riffs. Like, seriously, I've had root canals more enjoyable than this EP, and those lasted longer than this EP. For being like a little bit over 13 minutes, I think, this felt like a fucking eternity. I'm probably gonna have much worse things to say, you know, when it comes down to the Mötley Crüe ranking, so I'm kind of saving, you know, a bit of the disdain for this release in particular for that one. But yeah, this was hands down the worst thing I listened to this year. And, well, as soon as the Mötley Crüe ranking is done, or at least in terms of when I'm done with listening and taking notes and all that stuff, I am fucking done with this EP for fucking ever. And I really, really hope that this does not inspire the band to fucking punish us with a full-length release, because that would be as awesome as making Cancer airborne and contagious. But anyway, that is pretty much my list of most disappointing / bad albums this year. I figured, why not, you know, do this one, because I kind of do like complaining about albums a little bit. And this kind of balances out the whole huge glow up that I gave all the ones on my list, because, you know, outside of, well, these releases, I would say this year's been pretty solid in terms of metal. So yeah, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you were new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We also now have memberships. They are only 99 cents, and we do offer a members-only stream that we're going to pick that back up in January and kind of think of a theme for it, because, you know, we want to keep them like a little bit different than our regular streams, which are generally just us shooting the shit and being idiots. You guys are paying for these streams essentially, so we want them to kind of be a little bit different. We also have dumb emojis, which I constantly advertise, and I will be adding some. I have a couple in particular that I want to add, I just haven't got around to yet. And yeah, this is the new way to support the channel more directly. We also still have our store, thrallsmetal.com, with our t-shirts and hats. If you are interested in our our merch, there's a link down below in the description to thrallsmetal.com. And if you are interested in becoming a member, there's a join button down below. And of course, thank you guys for yet another awesome year of doing this. This has been an absolute boatload of fun. I'm already working on some other stuff for, probably like stuff that'll come up next year. We're probably going to take a little bit of a break. I know John's still got his list coming, and we're also lining up stuff for retro reviews in the future too. So yeah, there's a bunch of gears turning here. We just kind of focus on which gears we're turning a bit harder. I don't know if that works as like a parable, metaphor, simile, whatever that is. It doesn't really work, I think. Either way, I said it. Anyway, we love doing this, and that is large in part to you guys. You guys are just an absolutely amazing fan base, and it's just amazing to think we have a fan base after all this time. I will also be putting up a thing for our giveaway when we get to 20,000 subscribers, which honestly isn't too far off, so we're going to get on that. John definitely wants to be in that video, so I'm waiting a little bit for that one. And outside of that, my water heater turned on. Whatever. Thank you guys so much for everything you guys do. It means the world to us, and we will catch you later.